Hey there, everybody. It's Jenny Clark with Solvability. We've got another session of GovCon Summit today. It's really important to me today. My brother Bob was a Marine, passed away several years ago, but I wouldn't be where I am today if he hadn't taught me everything that he had learned about communicating with people and being able to translate that out here on the scene. My brother Bob was in Marine at the end of the Vietnam War. He had a high draft number and ended up going, spent most of that time as a Marine photographer. And I just wanted to honor it today because today's his birthday. So we've got special guest, Dr. Carlos Garcia in Tampa Bay and Jeff Haugland out in Colorado. And what I'd love to do is let each of you just kind of take it away. And what we want to share is what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how everybody else can participate as well.
Sure. Jeff, you want to get us started?
I would love to. So Jenny, thank you very much for having me. I'm very grateful for meeting you last year and then also for being able to be here again this year. Met some phenomenal people. So my name's Jeff Haugland. I'm a former EOD tech or explosive ordnance disposal technician. We were tasked with disarming IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I spent 10 years in the service and suffered my own traumatic blast injuries. I've got a spinal fusion and some TBI incidents from blast exposure. And in April 2015, about 2 years after I got out of the military, I almost took my own life. And I was fortunate enough to have my 4-year-old son at the time walk down a dark hall at 2 a.m. and knock on my door and ask, "Daddy, are you okay?" And I was so deep in the state of suffering that I was dealing with that I didn't even recognize he was in the house at the time. And when I heard his voice, that's all that I really needed to hear at that exact moment to understand that I almost transferred all of my trauma directly to him. And so I started making some better lifestyle decisions, and I stopped seeing the VA at that point because every time I'd walk into the VA, they just included another prescription that was making my symptoms worse. And about 6 weeks later, a mentor of mine walked out into his backyard on Memorial Day weekend and shot himself, leaving his 3-year-old son still in the house. And that became the catalyst for everything that's been since. My job has the highest suicide rate among any other job in the military, and we are looking at the problem all wrong. We're diagnosing psychological disorders when in reality we're supposed to be looking at the cumulative effect of blast overpressure and what traumatic brain injury can do in terms of presenting itself psychologically. And so we began researching more effective care, prescription-free interventions, how we can actually track and more accurately diagnose rather than just relying solely on patient reporting. And we created a nonprofit called the Invictus Project, which we've been able to treat. Oh man, over the last 2 years, we've been able to treat 33 patients. All of these patients have, I think about 70% of them actually attempted suicide at one point in their life. And then every single one of these patients has seen relief of symptoms. More importantly, they have their life back. They have, the control to dictate what they do and then the day's decisions, and that's been incredibly rewarding, especially when we get out, we lose a piece of ourselves and we figure out, how are we supposed to serve now that we're out? And this was the only way I knew how to move forward was, this is the way I can serve. So thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Jenny, for having me. So my name is Carlos Garcia. I'm a Marine Corps veteran with one deployment out to Iraq in 2004, right before I got out, and then transitioned into a career as a fireman and paramedic. After spending about 7 or 8 years there, I really started to sort of contemplate this idea of post-traumatic stress and sort of seeing the role that played both in the military, but also on the fire department with folks that were exposed to, high levels of trauma almost daily in some instances. And also not just the post-traumatic stress, but this idea that I came to later find out about, which was post-traumatic growth, because I was working and had worked with a bunch of folks who just, despite this level of exposure to trauma, just had these resilient traits that allowed them to navigate life in a way that felt, more value, right? They sort of understood the presence of their life and were able to carry some of those things forward throughout their career. So I started thinking to myself, what if I were to study some of these traits, whatever it is, characteristics, personalities, and we can identify some data regarding what these items are, and if it's something that we can teach, right? Is there something we can implement into a boot camp? Is there something we can implement into a fire academy or police academy where we can teach these folks before they encounter the trauma to have some of that resiliency? Throughout my time there, I found that I really gravitated to the therapy part of it, the psychotherapy, the talk therapy, if you will, counseling. There's several names for it out there, and developed a huge passion to go against this significant stigma around mental health that we still have. I think we're doing a lot better than we were 10, 20 years ago, but there's still so much more work to do. And so I try to find any platform that I can, whether it's in individual therapy or in the community. I'm a public speaker as well, to see what we can do about this stigma. And so as I was understanding that, I really enjoyed the therapy part. I realized, here's a person that has had the background, who's sort of been there, done that, from a civil service point of view, from a veteran point of view, and sort of started to, market myself in that way and make my services available to veterans and make my services available to some of the civil service heroes out there. And it was amazing to see the sort of, engagement that I got, but also the sort of healing that I saw. Right. I was just speaking with Jeff a minute ago. I've had veterans, some of the toughest men and women in my office, and, within the first session, break down crying and saying to me, I've been holding on to this for 20, 30 years. I've never said this to anybody, not even, another veteran buddy. And so I think it's about that power of telling your story, but also providing this, as a provider, providing a safe space where there's no judgment, where there is no, okay, so how are we going to focus on fixing this? It's not about fixing. It's about, you've been struggling. It's about, tell me your story. It's about, how has this impacted you, your family? And, sitting in a session and just being able to share in that moment, there's a selfish piece to me, which is like, it moves me to my core, to help give that gift to folks. So that's sort of where I'm coming from that counseling perspective. And to just be able to see some of these veterans come through and find their healing, improve their relationship with their kids and their families, and to find that sense of purpose again, like Jeff was saying, that here we had this structured way of finding our value, and in a lot of ways, when we get out, we've lost that identity. Right. And it's a dark, grieving process that we have to go through. And I think when we talk about helping veterans in this transition process, it's not about just getting them a job. It's not about just education or any of those things. Those are all important and valuable, but it's about, how do we get you to now find your sense of inner value in this world in a very different way. And so that's sort of some of the work that I'm doing now.
You're on mute, Jenny.
So hearing you tell these stories just brought a lot of things to my mind. Coming up in a military family, it was like, I have 4 brothers and my dad, and he was a big man, and he never got upset. And so in our family, nobody got upset. Suck it up, buttercup was the buzzword. We don't air our dirty laundry. And this is like the buzzwords of our entire family. We don't talk about this. And it is so common anyway. But you're right that we've been treating an injury as though it's mental health. And then there's the stigma around that. But the last thing anybody who is served and has pride has been, they just are not going to share. They've always been in that, whatever you do, never talk about this. Trained from the very beginning, and everything that goes on in military families, we don't talk about this. And how do you get families to get involved? What is your best way of doing that? Jeff, can I start with you?
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that. And it's funny because I actually say suck it up, buttercup all the time to my kids. But yeah, it's hard because, as veterans and first responders, we see the worst part of humanity, right? And we want to do everything we can to protect the lens that our loved ones are seeing the world through, because we've seen what that filter does for their own enjoyment, and we seem to have lost that filter. So there's a reason that we don't talk about it with our loved ones. Number one, they're not going to be able to relate to us. They're not really going to be able to fully understand and comprehend how life-changing that has been for us. And number two, it's that, like, our job as as soldiers and service members is to try and protect our loved ones, right? And so the last thing we want to do is introduce anything that's going to affect the lens for which they view the world through. The big thing for us is, and this is something that we would like to include when it comes to the loved ones and family members, is that vets especially have a very hard time talking to anybody who has not been under fire. Like, it's one thing to say that you're a vet, but if you haven't been under fire, most of these guys have seen the trauma or are dealing with, blast injuries. They're not going to want to share their story unless somebody has actually been in the trenches and can fully understand that moment and the environmental factors at play. And so one of the things that we really like doing once these guys start going through our treatment protocol is to include the family members so that they can understand what sort of walls have been built up based off of the quality of life that they've been living, and what they can expect or open themselves up to the possibility of what their life could look like afterward. Because the hardest part is that we can provide medical treatment and medical interventions for these guys, but if they go right back to the same environment where their lifestyle and some of the decisions that they're making are the exact same in their homes, some of their symptoms are going to return. And frankly, the worst part about mental health issues is that our lifestyle decisions dramatically affect whether we get better in terms of the symptom management portion, or if those symptoms return. Our diet, our exercise, our sleep, our communication with our loved ones, those all play a factor into my health and well-being. And if I can't change the home life and include the loved ones, the family members and the kids, and say, daddy or mommy used to be this way, but they're doing everything they can to get better. And this is what we want you to look for. And this is what we want you to try and engage with them. We don't want them to talk about their trauma with their children, because that's something the veteran doesn't want to do, right? They're looking for somebody who can relate to them, and that they're trying to protect the last thing that they love in this world, which is their family members. They don't want to bring up the pain and the trauma and the human suffering that they've seen with their loved ones. But we want to make sure that those loved ones give them an opportunity to grow into what they can be once they've had treatment. And that's the hardest part for us, is figuring out how we can include the wife and the children in a manner that allows these veterans to finally see complete relief of symptoms and change their home life.
Well, that's so important. And Carlos, I'm sure you've got a lot of ways that you involve the families, and with your broader background with the fire department and others, you've seen it with people that are faced in this an entire career of that. Tell us some more.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd actually, before doing that, would like to address that suck it up, buttercup mentality, and those things that we hear, right? I heard them too. My father was in the military. One of the issues I take there is, I think we're coming from a great place in sort of saying, as parents, we want to help build some resilience in our children and understand that, they can get through difficult times, but we're actually doing them quite a disservice, right? One of the worst things that I could hear a parent tell a child is, why are you crying? You have no reason to cry. That's like telling an adult, why are you sad? You have no reason to be sad. You have no reason to be depressed, right? And so I think, this idea of like the toxic male masculinity thing, right? We're told our whole lives to suck it up and not feel. And guess what? We're human beings. We have emotions. So you can think you're sucking it up. You can think you're repressing it, but it's going to bleed out in some area of your life. That's why from, the age of 15 to 20 something, I was just such an angry kid, right? Because I was told to repress my emotions my whole life. Well, then I joined the Marine Corps, and, so there was more of that message. And so here I am, then going into the fire department, and the same thing. Here I am at 32 and still, road rage and this, and probably using a little bit of drinking more than I needed to deal with my emotions, which just wasn't helpful, right? It like I said, it can have some problems. When I think we talk about telling your story, I think there's a different way of doing it. We don't have to share with our family and close people, the trauma, right? What happened, the war. But we can share with them that we're struggling, right? We can share with them that, like, I'm just having a really tough week, or I'm feeling anxious, or right now I don't have the energy to engage. Can you understand? Can you help support me in that? Can you give me a little patience this week because I'm feeling extra irritable? Can you sit with me as I'm navigating this space? A lot of people with trauma that I work with, for instance, I might work with a young lady who had a sexual molestation, or several, when she was younger. I don't care for her to ever tell me the specifics about of that incident, but I help her sort of move around that space of, like, what was that like for you? How did it impact your childhood? How does it impact you now? What are you doing for a sense of value and purpose? How did that impact your self-esteem and your sense of self-worth? Right. So while we don't have to address it specifically, I think we can do some amazing work around it that can still help to change people's lives. And as Jeff was saying, and what they're doing, the family is vitally crucial, because I can do all of the best work in my office with someone, but if they go back out into that environment that's toxic for them, or not supportive, then we're wasting our time. So it's important for me to bring in the family, whether it's to bring in the kids at some point, or the spouse, to have some conversations about what is really happening with mental health, what is really happening with this depression, how does it manifest, how is it how's it playing out for that person's life. So I think we need to include more of that and bring the people who are day-to-day support in our treatment.
Well, you've said, go ahead, Jeff.
Sorry, I wanted to bring up one of the most powerful things that I ever got a chance to do was so I've actually had our treatment protocol. I've gone through the entire protocol, and I was having 5 to 6 migraines a week. I was self-medicating. I was drinking about a fifth of whiskey every single day at the time. The VA had me on 12 different prescriptions while I was trying to seek help. And I remember talking to my son about a year after my treatment and saying, how do you think Daddy's different? And to hear his perspective on what has changed in his life and how my interaction with him has changed was by far the most powerful and moving thing I have ever heard, because my son was 4 at the time. He didn't really understand why Daddy was suffering. But when I finally got treatment, and a year later, I could hear the amount of value that I was adding to his life at that point, it allowed me to say, I don't have to hold this against myself any longer, because now I can finally show up the way I want to show up in his life.
Yeah, I think that's so important. You've talked about compartmentalizing, which is a big thing of what you're supposed to be doing. And then the other thing that you really said, Jeff, was the idea of transferring your trauma to others, so that you've received trauma through what you've done, and unless you find a way, it's going to keep spreading. And alcohol is probably the easiest way to self-medicate. And I know, as a 30-year recovering alcoholic after 30 years, I mean, that was what we did in our house. That was the way we related. And it's so common that we've always had these different ways of coping that are very flawed. And I really appreciate both of you being on today to talk about your experience and what you're doing. And go ahead, if you would, and put in the comments how that people could reach out with you. But Dr. Garcia, thank you very much for being with us today. And he put his email in there. You can also find him on LinkedIn. And Jeff Haugland with the Invictus Project and Invictus Health as well. Thanks so much for being on today.